When Scout accidentally knocks a bottle of Gross Spice, that makes the meatball really big. Scout says, "Hi, Deer Squad. Hi, Kitty." And then the Deer Squad Rocky Kitty says, "Hi, Scout." The Scout says, "I'm so happy to see you." Where Scout says, "I'm the chef today, and everybody loves my meatballs." Where Kai says, "Scout, I bet everybody loves your meatballs." Where Scout says, "Yeah, Kai, everybody loves my meatballs." Where Scout says, "But not just that." Where Kai says, "What's that, Scout?" Where Scout says, "I had the secret ingredient." Where Scout says, "The secret ingredient is Gross Spice." Then the Deer Squad says, "Whoa." The Scout says, "Yeah, Gross Spice is glittery, it's sparkly, and it's a secret ingredient." Where Scout says, "Let me show you." Where Scout says, "You use an itty bitty pour, and that makes the meatball grow into a different size." Where Scout says, "But don't use too much." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Hey, Scout, can I have a go?" Where Scout says, "Oh, no, Kitty. I'm a grown-up cat, and I'm the only one who can use the Gross Spice, because you know what happens if you use too much." Where Rocky Kitty says, "No, what will happen?" Also, Ramy says, "Hey, Scout, I bet the customers want your more meatballs." Where Kai says, "Yeah, everybody loves your meatballs." Where Scout says, "Yeah." Where Scout says, "Yeah, guys." Where Scout says, "What are you waiting for? Let's get to work." Where Rocky Kitty says, "I'll get the plates." Where Kai says, "We'll deserve the customers." Where Scout says, "And I'll keep making the meatballs." Where Scout says, "When you're making the meatball, be careful. Don't use too much Gross Spice." The Scout says, "Because that will be bad. That will be bad. Really, really." Where Scout says, "Huh? That's weird. Gross Spice bottle is empty." Where Scout says, "Oh, now I see. They must have all spilled and made a giant meatball." This Scout says, "Giant meatball!" This Scout says, "Ah!" This Scout says, "Ah!" Where Scout says, "Help!" Where Rocky Kitty says, "Uh-oh, Scout's stuck inside that giant meatball." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Don't worry, Scout, I'll save you." Also, Lola cashed in Rocky Kitty. Kai says, "Kitty, are you okay?" Where Rocky Kitty says, "I'm okay, but I can't catch up to that giant meatball." Then Lola says, "What giant meatball?" Then Rocky Kitty says, "That giant meatball." And then Kai says, "Whoa, that's the biggest meatball I ever seen." Then Lola says, "And Scout stuck inside." This Scout said, "I know." And then Ramy said, "I got a not so good feeling about this." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Yeah, me too. I got a not so good feeling about this." Where Rocky Kitty says, "How do we rescue Scout?" Where Rocky Kitty says, "Hey, let's all power it up." Where Kai says, "We need," then he says, "Planet Power Boost." Where Rocky Kitty says, "Hey, I'm the Hedge Kitty again. I'm a mighty kitty." Where Rocky Kitty says, "These new suits are awesome." Where Scout says, "Help!" Where Rocky Kitty says, "Don't worry, Scout, we're coming." Also, the worker says, "Me, my jackhammer, and that giant meatball." Giant meatball! Also, Kai says, "Kitty, watch your step." Then Rocky Kitty says, "My step? Oh, my shoelace must be untied." Then he says, "Nope, must be the other shoe." Then he said, "Wait a second. Planet Power Boost don't have shoelaces." Then he said, "Yeah." Luckily, Lola cashed at him. Kai says, "Uh-oh, the giant meatball turned on all the construction machines." Where Rocky Kitty says, "How do we rescue Scout? And how do we get past that wrecking ball and the sticky cement?" Where Kai says, "Don't worry, Kitty, we'll show you." Also, Scout says, "Help!" Where Rocky Kitty says, "Hold on tight, Scout." Rocky Kitty says, "Wow, all that swimming can make you wet." And then Rocky Kitty shake the water off, and that made the Deer Squad laugh. Also, DJ Part 3 says, "Yeah, meatball." Then she took off her glasses, and she left her glasses behind. Also, Trixie says, "Trixie's great. She has her purse, her kitties, and that giant meatball." Where Trixie says, "A giant meatball?" Where Scout says, "Help!" Where Scout says, "Somebody rescue us before we crash too." "Ah! Yeah!" Where Scout says, "A bubbly swamp." Where Scout says, "Ah!" Or when Scout says, "To me, Kitty." Also, Kitty says, "To me, Scout."